There is an old saying among the seed people, the ones who work with what most others throw away. The pressed thing gives more than the whole thing ever promised. It sounds like a riddle until you watch it proven. Then it sounds like an apology that arrived too late to help the people who needed it most, and exactly on time for the one who already knew. This is the story of a woman who was written off the same year her crop was, and who spent the next 4 years in a converted equipment shed in the high, dry country of the northern interior, doing something that everyone who passed by agreed was either grief made practical or practicality made absurd. She pressed oil. She pressed it from flaxseed that the regional cooperative had deemed commercially unsalvageable, locked in airtight drums in a shed that smelled of iron and cold linseed, and she sold that oil in small amber bottles with handwritten labels to people who at first pitied her and later drove 3 hours to reach her. She did not advertise. She did not explain herself to anyone who did not ask directly, and even then her answers were short enough to fit on a seed packet. By the time the regional market collapsed and the cooperative storage system failed in the same fortnight, leaving several hundred contract growers with grain they could not move and debts they could not service, her single small press had generated enough cash to retire the operating loan on the full 80 acres. She had not rushed. She had not borrowed. She had not pivoted. She had simply read her grandmother's notebooks and believed them, and then worked every morning before anyone else was awake, in a building no one thought was worth insuring. The pressed thing gives more than the whole thing ever promised. Her name was Dara Solis. She was 53 years old when the cooperative field agent drove out to survey the flax that had been left unharvested through the long, wet autumn, and she was still 53 when he told her, without cruelty and without any particular warmth, that the seed lots were too far gone. The moisture readings were off. The color was wrong. There was a grading issue that involved a term she recognized from her grandmother's notebooks as something that sounded technical, but mostly meant that the people doing the grading were not being paid to look harder. He said it gently, the way people say things gently when they have already decided, and merely need the other person to accept the verdict without making it difficult for anyone. She asked him how far off the moisture was. He read her the number. She asked him what the floor threshold was. He told her. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That is a 12% gap." He said, "Yes." She said, "I understand." He said he was sorry about the season, that it had been hard on everyone, that the cooperative had a hardship provision she might want to look at, and he left her a pamphlet printed in 2 colors on paper that felt expensive. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket and went back into the shed, where her grandmother's notebooks were stacked on a workbench next to a disassembled cold press unit she had bought from an estate sale for $900. The press was a commercial model from the previous generation of equipment, manufactured by a company that no longer existed under that name. It weighed 460 pounds. She had moved it herself with a rented pallet jack and the patient assistance of her neighbor's eldest child, a 14-year-old named Fen who did not talk much and who had a habit of watching things very carefully before touching them, which Dara appreciated as a philosophical disposition. The notebooks had been her grandmother Petty Solis's, written in a dense, slanting hand that mixed 3 languages depending on the subject. Agricultural chemistry was in one language, commercial arithmetic was in a second. Everything that had to do with what a thing was worth beyond its market price was written in the third, which was the language the family had arrived with and which Dara had learned late, from cassette tapes, out of necessity rather than sentiment. What the notebook said about flax, specifically about flax that had been moisture-stressed during the early development of its seed case, was detailed and specific and ran across 47 pages. Petty Solis had grown flax in a drier climate than this one for 18 years before she came to this country, and what she had learned she had written down with the precision of someone who suspected she might not always be there to explain it in person. What the notebook said, in the language of agricultural chemistry, was this: seed that fails the commercial moisture threshold for whole grain sale is not the same thing as seed that fails the threshold for oil extraction. The oil is already there. It does not care about the grade. It cares about temperature and pressure and time, and it will come out if you ask it correctly. There were 3 pages that dealt with the specific range of conditions Dara was facing. Petty had faced something similar in her 3rd year, in a place far from here, and she had pressed the seed and sold the oil at 4 times the value she would have received from the grain merchant. She had written the numbers down, and next to the numbers she had written a phrase in the 3rd language that Dara translated, slowly and with a dictionary, as, "What the merchant cannot use, the kitchen can love." Dara read those pages many times over the course of the wet autumn, while the unharvested flax stood in the field past the point of conventional hope, and she made her calculations on the back pages of a spiral notebook because she did not own a spreadsheet she trusted. She had 80 acres. The average seed yield for stressed flax in her soil type, accounting for the bad year, was conservatively a little over 500 pounds per acre. She would not get the full yield. She would get perhaps 60%, which meant something in the neighborhood of 24,000 pounds of seed. Cold-pressed flax oil ran at roughly a 30% extraction rate under proper conditions, meaning around 7,200 pounds of oil, which was approximately 870 gallons. The market for cold-pressed, human-grade linseed oil at that time, in specialty food and supplement channels, was sitting between $40 and $60 per gallon, depending on purity and presentation. She wrote down the low number and divided it by 2 because she was her grandmother's granddaughter and did not plan on the good case. Even at $20 a gallon, which was a number she had reduced deliberately to account for every difficulty she could imagine, the math came back larger than the operating loan on the farm. Not enormously larger, but larger. She checked it 3 times. She read the numbers. She read them again. Then she put the notebook away and drove into town to find someone who could help her harvest a crop that everyone had already agreed was finished. The cooperative field agent, whose name was Marcus Thiel, did not hear about the harvest until it was mostly complete, because it was done with equipment borrowed from 2 different families on back roads that did not pass the cooperative's facility. Fen helped. Fen's father helped on 2 of the longer days, saying nothing about what he thought and doing the work with the same watchful patience his child had inherited. A woman from the next township who had known Dara's grandmother when Petey was still alive came for 3 days and brought food each morning in containers that stacked neatly on the passenger seat of her truck. Her name was Greta, and she was 71 years old, and she had the look of someone who had spent 60 years waiting to see something proven and was finally in the right place at the right time. She did not say this. She helped stack the filled bags, and she read a few pages of the notebooks when Dara offered them, and she nodded at what she read in the way that people nod when they recognize something they already knew but had stopped expecting the world to confirm. Marcus Thiel did drive past once during that period. He slowed. He saw Fen moving between rows with a gathering rake and Dara operating the swather that she had borrowed from the family 2 properties north. He rolled down the window. He said something that was either a question or a statement of concern, and Dara, who was making a tight turn at the edge of the field, lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel in a gesture that meant she had heard him and would address it later, and he drove on. Later did not come for approximately 14 months. She pressed through the winter. She started in the 2nd week of November, when the seed had been cleaned and dried to a level that the cold press preferred. And she worked from before first light until the temperature in the shed made extended work impractical, which in that climate was about 6 hours on a good day. The press was loud in a low, grinding way that was oddly peaceful once you stopped hearing it as noise and started hearing it as a rhythm. The oil came out the extraction spout into a receiving vessel, and from there into settling tanks she had built from food-grade containers, and after settling it was racked off clear and amber and smelled like something between bread and soil and the inside of a very old wooden box, which she found she did not have a word for in any of the 3 languages. Fen came several mornings a week before school and watched the press run and asked questions that were more precise than most adults would have managed, and Dara answered them fully because the questions deserved it. What is the ideal platen temperature? What happens to the phospholipids under excess heat? Why does the cake come out drier on some loads than others? She answered each question as her grandmother's notebooks had answered them, which was directly and without condescension. Fen wrote the answers in a small notebook of their own, which Dara noticed and chose not to comment on. The bottles she ordered in cases of 200 from a supplier who did not ask what they were for. The labels she printed on a machine she already owned and filled in by hand with the pressing date, the lot number, and the variety. Golden flax, cold-pressed, single origin. She did not put her name on the labels. She did not put the farm name on the labels. She put the information the oil needed to be understood, and she let the oil speak for what it was. The first customers found her the way that good things used to be found before finding became an industry, which was by word from someone who had actually tasted it. A woman in a city 3 hours south had bought a bottle from a small food shop that had bought a case from Dara at a price she was embarrassed to charge, because she had not yet learned what she was selling. That woman told a physician. The physician asked about sourcing. The food shop called Dara and relayed the question. Dara said it was available. The physician's office placed an order for 12 cases, which was 240 bottles, and paid on receipt, which no one had ever done before in Dara's experience of selling anything. She was not a businesswoman in any way she would have claimed for herself. But she understood ratios. She understood that 12 cases at the price she was charging was a number with a certain relationship to her remaining debt load. And she stood in the shed after reading the bank notification and felt something that was not exactly joy and was not exactly relief, but was the particular sensation of having been correct in a way that had cost her a significant amount of pride and energy to keep believing. In the town, the opinion of Dara Solis had been consistent and mostly kind in texture and mostly wrong in content. People thought she was grieving incorrectly. Her husband had died 4 years before the bad season, and the farm had been his before it was theirs, and the received wisdom in that community was that a woman alone on 80 acres of flax was a woman who needed to either sell or partner or at minimum accept some help from the people who were equipped to provide it. The cooperative had offered her a contract with favorable first-year terms. She had read the contract and declined. Marcus Thiel had been the person who delivered the offer, and Marcus Thiel had taken the decline personally in the way that people take declines personally when they were told the offer was a generous one. Her nearest neighbor, a man named Corvin who farmed 300 acres of mixed grain and considered himself a resource for the region, had come by twice to suggest that she was in over her head and that he knew someone at a land management firm who was good people and who could help her see her options clearly. He brought food both times, which made it harder to be direct with him, and Dara accepted the food and thanked him and said she was fine, and he said he could see she was doing her best and drove away in a truck that cost more than the equipment she was using to press oil, and that would later be repossessed, though that was not something anyone knew yet. There was a couple who had moved into the old Marchand House property the previous year, city people with children, who were friendly and meant well and who stopped by one afternoon to ask if she was all right, because they had seen lights in the shed at 4 in the morning for several weeks running. She said she was pressing. They asked pressing what? She said flax. They looked at each other in the manner of people who are trying to decide whether what they are hearing is a metaphor for something else, and then the woman said, well, they were right next door, if she needed anything, and the man pressed a jar of preserved fruit into her hands that they had made from their own trees, and they left looking faintly troubled. Greta came back in January and stayed for 2 weeks. She was the only person in Dara's life at that point who knew the full plan and who expressed her opinion of it by helping with it rather than by describing it. She cleaned the press on the days Dara's hands were too sore for the detailed work. She read the notebooks in the evenings and sometimes copied passages into her own book. On the last evening before she drove home, she said, "Your grandmother would not be surprised by any of this." Dara said, "I know." Greta said she would be surprised it took the flax. Dara said, "She might." And that was the longest conversation they had in the 2 weeks, and it was sufficient. The pressed thing gives more than the whole thing ever promised. By the following autumn, 18 months into the pressing operation, Dara had sold through nearly 60% of the oil she had extracted from the stressed season crop. She had also, because she could not press flax for 6 hours a day without learning to love it, planted the full 80 acres again, this time with two varieties chosen specifically for their oil character rather than their commercial seed grade. She had obtained the seed from a heritage supplier who operated out of a catalog that looked like it had been typeset in the previous century, and who answered the phone himself and who told her, when she explained what she was doing, that there were 6 people in the country he knew of doing it at her scale, and that she was the only one pressing the variety she had chosen, which meant if she wanted to sell through specialty channels, she had no competitor, which also meant she had no established price, which meant she could set one. She set a price that was fair, and that also, worked across the full yield of a good season, meant the farm would carry itself without the operating loan she had retired, and without the cooperative contract she had declined. She did not celebrate this. She noted it and turned the press on and began the morning session. In that second autumn, Corvin lost his contract with the Regional Grain Board over a paperwork issue that turned out to be a symptom of a deeper cash flow problem that turned out to be a symptom of the fact that he had been operating at a scale his land could not genuinely support for 3 years and had been servicing his debt with a confidence that had no root in any notebook anyone had ever written. The truck was gone. The second parcel he had acquired was gone. He was farming his original acreage with equipment he did not own, and the people at the land management firm he had recommended to Dara were now his own advisors, which they had been for 3 months before they recommended that he sell to the company they represented, which he eventually did. Marcus Thiel's cooperative, in that same autumn and the winter following, experienced a storage failure of a kind that had been predicted in the industry press for 2 years and ignored because the prediction came from academics rather than from people with contracts. A combination of factors involving humidity control and a structural issue in 2 of the large storage buildings led to a spoilage event that affected a significant portion of the region's stored grain. The losses were covered partially by insurance and partially by the cooperative's reserve fund, which the insurance payout reduced to a level that could not sustain the next season's advance contracts. Growers who had been counting on those advances had nowhere to pivot in the timeline they had available. Several had already committed to inputs. The season turned cold early. By February, the phones in that county were ringing in a way that meant things were serious. Dara heard about it through Fen, who was 17 by then and who heard about everything and reported the relevant fraction with a precision that Dara had come to rely on as she relied on the temperature gauge on the press. She did not react to the news in the moment. She was running a load and the extraction was going well, and she had learned not to stop a good extraction for anything that wasn't the shed on fire. She noted the information. She thought about it during the evening, and she made 2 calls the next morning, both short, and then she spent the following week setting a different kind of plan in motion. What she did was simple enough that it looked either obvious or reckless depending on where you stood. She contacted the 3 growers in her immediate area who had been hardest hit by the cooperative situation and who had acreage that could carry flax in the coming season, and she offered them a purchasing arrangement on terms she had written out clearly on a single sheet of paper. She would buy their stressed or off-grade seed at a price above what the cooperative had been offering for on-grade grain. She would press it herself. They would share in the revenue above her cost of processing on a formula she had borrowed from the arithmetic pages of Petey's notebooks. She did not offer them charity. She offered them a ratio, which was a different thing entirely, because a ratio can be verified by anyone who can do arithmetic, which means it requires no trust that cannot be earned by simply checking the math. 2 of the 3 agreed immediately. The third came back 3 weeks later, after his initial arrangement with a different buyer fell through, and he agreed on the same terms without asking for better ones, which Dara appreciated as a sign that he was dealing with the situation rather than with his ego about the situation. Marcus Thiel came to see her on a morning in early March, when the light was still thin and the mud season had not fully declared itself. He drove his cooperative vehicle, which had the logo on the side, and he parked in the same place he always had, which was at the edge of the equipment shed's gravel apron, and he sat in the cab for a moment before he came to the door. She had seen him from the press room window, and she had turned the press off and waited. He looked like a man who was carrying something that had no good place to be set down. He said her name. She said, "Come in." He came in and looked at the press and the settling tanks and the rows of filled bottles waiting for labels and the notebooks open on the workbench and the hand-lettered chart on the wall that tracked daily output against the remaining seed inventory. He looked at all of it for a moment that lasted longer than he may have intended. Then he said, "I misjudged what you were doing out here." She said, "Yes." He said, "I came because I wanted to say that to you." She said, "I know." He said, "I don't know what you're doing now with the arrangement you've made with Pellert and the others." She said, "Pressing their oil." He said, "Is there room in that for more growers?" She said, "I thought you might ask that." She handed him a copy of the one-page document she had prepared, because she had made more copies than she needed for the 3 growers, and she had made them for exactly this question, and she had done this without gloating and without planning a speech, and without having any particular expression on her face when she did it. He read it slowly. He asked 2 questions. She answered both. He said he would have to look at what volume was available from the affected members and get back to her. She said, "Take your time. The math doesn't change." He folded the paper and put it in his inside pocket, and she walked him to the door and watched him drive back down the track, and then she went back inside and turned the press on and ran another load. She hired Fen formally that spring, which meant she paid them a wage she could document rather than a gratitude she could not. Fen was 18 and had decided, in the way of people who have spent 4 years watching something work, that they understood this well enough to do it and wanted to do it rather than anything else available to them at that moment. They were correct about the understanding. They took over the pressing operation on the days Dara managed the purchasing arrangements and the bottling logistics, which had grown to a point where she could not be in the press room every morning and also keep track of the incoming seed volumes and the outgoing oil orders and the accounting that connected these things. Fen understood the press better than she did now, in the technical sense, though Dara still understood the seed better, which was a distribution of knowledge she found appropriate and said nothing about. The arrangement with the cooperative members ran for 2 seasons and then expanded in a way Dara had not planned but also had not prevented, which was that several of the growers asked if she would teach what she was doing. She said she could show them the notebooks. 3 of them said yes. She made careful copies of the relevant pages, with her own annotations in the margins where the conditions differed from what her grandmother had faced, and she conducted what she refused to call a workshop because that word implied a formality the shed did not support. She called it a walk-through. 4 people came to the first one, 8 came to the second. By the third, which she held on a Saturday in late autumn when the press was running and they could watch the full sequence in real time, there were 14 people in a building that was designed for 4, and Fen managed the crowding with a calm that Dara recognized as the disposition of someone who would be running this without her in a decade, which was precisely what she had intended from the moment she hired them. The farm did not become famous. Farms do not become famous. The things people learn on them sometimes do, slowly and by proximity. What became known in that county and eventually in the broader community of small-scale oilseed producers was that there was a method, documented and teachable and grounded in a set of notebooks that had been written by a woman who pressed oil in a different country on a different continent under different conditions, but with the same basic conviction, that the seed contains what the market cannot see, and that patience and pressure and the right temperature are sufficient to bring it out. Dara was 61 years old when she first allowed the notebooks to be photographed for preservation. She had resisted this for several years on the grounds that a photograph is not the same thing as a reading, which is not the same thing as a doing, and that the transmission of the knowledge required all 3 in sequence. By 61, she had watched enough people do all 3 in sequence that she was satisfied the chain would hold, and she sat at the workbench with Fen while a conservator from a university collection worked through each page, and she translated the passages in the 3rd language aloud, slowly and without notes, because she did not need the dictionary anymore. She sold the first parcel of the farm at 64, not under pressure but because the operation had matured to a point where 80 acres was more land than the pressing model required. And because there was a young couple from the district who needed land and who had been doing things with it in her line of thinking, and she sold it to them at a price that was fair and not the price she could have gotten from the development inquiry that had come to her 3 times in that decade, and which she had each time declined without explaining why, because an explanation was not what was owed. The press ran until she was 69. The work of keeping it running became Fenn's work, and then became work that Fenn shared with 2 people they had trained, one of whom was the child of one of the cooperative growers who had signed on in the hard year. The press room was expanded once to house a second unit, and the notebooks lived on the workbench in the original space, in a case that Fenn had made from material recovered from the original equipment shed's wall, and which was sealed against moisture in the way that oilseed operations must account for, which is to say carefully and permanently, and with an understanding of what the air can do to a thing over time. On the wall of the expansion, where the light came in from the east in the morning, Fenn had lettered a phrase in 3 languages, the same phrase in each, in a hand that was self-taught and steady, and which required 6 attempts before Fenn was satisfied with the spacing. The phrase was the one Dara had stopped saying aloud because she no longer needed to, having said it enough times that it now lived in the press room the way that heat lives in a stone wall well past sunset. The pressed thing gives more than the whole thing ever promised. In the agricultural extension record for that county, there is a notation from the decade following the cooperative's difficult years that references a shift in small-scale oilseed processing in the region, attributed to a combination of improved technique and increased grower awareness of off-grade seed value. The notation does not name anyone. It records percentages and acreages and economic outcomes in the dry language of official records, which is the language in which most true things are eventually written, at a distance from the people who made them true. The notebooks are in 2 places now, the originals in the university collection, and the working copies on the bench in the press room, annotated across 4 generations of margins in 4 different handwriting styles, which is how knowledge moves when it moves correctly, which is to say slowly and by contact and with the weight of everything that came before it pressing gently through.